history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Tuesday edition of Point of View. I've been really looking forward to this interview, and we're going to be spending some time talking with our good friend, Dr. Michael Youssef. A little bit later, we'll get into some other issues with Noah Gould, the columnist, I should say, as a moral compass. And they'll be looking at Trump and tariffs and all sorts of other things in the news. So we have a lot to cover over the next 2 hours. But first of all, I want to certainly mention that this book is one that I've been looking forward to talking about. I'd seen it first. Then on TBN, I saw some of the great material put together by his organization, Leading the Way, and I think you're going to really enjoy as we spend some time really digging into the 7 letters that Jesus actually gives to the churches in Asia Minor. So I think you're going to benefit from that, and I think immediately see some connections to churches in the first century to churches in the 21st century. And again, Michael Youssef, no stranger to this broadcast, founder and president of Leading the Way, probably best known as the pastor of the Church of the Apostles in Atlanta, Georgia. His television and radio programs are heard worldwide, and he is the author of about 50 different books. This one, God's Final Call, How the Book of Revelation Pulls Back the Veil on Current Events and Our Ultimate Future. Dr. Michael Youssef, always a delight to have you on the program.
It is pure joy. My dear brother, you have truly inspired millions of people in this country by serious talk about issues, serious, not frivolous stuff. And so I am always honored to be with you on your program. And I love you and love your ministry. Thank you for having me.
In just a few minutes, we'll, after we talk about the book, also talk about Awake America, because I, of course, on your mailing list and have some of the material you've sent out. But let's get into this, because when you go to the book of Revelation, first of all, you recognize the first 3 chapters are kind of warnings and encouragement. Then chapters 4 through almost 20 are the really talking about coming judgment, and then finally 21 and 22, the coming new heaven. But chapters 2 and 3 really take us to these 7 churches in Asia Minor, which is Turkey, one of which we're going to be at just about a month from now with the Point of View tour in Ephesus. But in the midst of this here, John is in Patmos. We're also taking people there as well. And he is actually saying that on the Lord's day I was in the Spirit. And many people interpret that to mean, well, that happened on Sunday. But you really help us understand that really what he was seeing is a future judgment on Lord's Day. Can you explain that to us?
Yes. In fact, the term the Lord's Day had not become known in the church until really later, way later after John. So he couldn't possibly be talking about the Lord's Day in terms of Sunday. It is the day of judgment. And you know, Amos and so many of the Old Testament prophets talk about the Lord's Day, the day of judgment. I said, don't think that's going to be a day of fun, but it's going to be a day of judgment. And sort of sobering warning from the prophets in the Old Testament talking about the day of the Lord. And that's basically where John was transponded, I guess, to the very future and recognizing the day of the Lord and the day of judgment that is coming. And therefore, he's warning the church within the circle, because you go into Ephesus, which is now, I guess, Izmir, and I've been there, and he was the pastor of that church, and he was away from that church in exile. And so he was basically focusing on the importance of the day of reckoning.
Yes.
That's the day of the Lord.
Well, again, this chapter on Ephesus, we'll get to in just a minute, is certainly the first of those. As people might imagine, 9 chapters, an introduction, a conclusion, and then the 7 chapters on the 7 churches. But before we get into specifics, I think it is telling that when we see some of the criticism as well as commendation, 5 out of the 7 find themselves not exactly making the cut. And so in some respects, it's a reminder that anybody that thinks, well, it was all easy in the first century, and so what's wrong with the church today? They were facing a time of persecution, and you begin your book by talking about the fact that we are facing persecution as well, aren't we?
Absolutely. In fact, 1 out of 7 believers in the Lord Jesus Christ around the world right now at this very moment are living under persecution, severe persecution. And when you think about even in the West, and just take England, for example, which I have had a ministry there and a presence and an office for 23 years. And now if a person literally stands and prays, can be arrested, but a Muslim can block the streets in masses to do their religious up and down worshiping of Allah, they are fine. And this is happening all across the world. And this is just the beginning of persecution coming to the West. In my judgment, that's is going to be the former Christendom's Babylonian exile, that they rejected Christ, they rejected the truth in Europe, and the land of Wesley and Latham and Ridley and Cranmer, now is focusing more on the importance of Islam and the persecution of true Christians than any other Western country. And that tells me that this persecution that so many of our brothers and sisters, whether Pakistan or Africa and the Middle East, are suffering is coming to us. We may be, God given us some reprieve here in America, but nonetheless, the forces of evil are constantly working, and was going to lead, I guess, to the tribulation where the suffering is going to be the norm.
Let me just real quickly then maybe dig into one of the particular churches, and that is Ephesus. We've already mentioned that. A letter of lost love. You begin by using the illustration of divorce. Oftentimes you have a couple that were in love when they were at the altar, then they get married, and then they lose their first love. In some respects, that's a great illustration of what happened in the church in Ephesus.
Absolutely. Or even without a divorce, there are so many couples who are literally living like roommates and that don't have that intimacy and that fervor that once they've experienced. And I just give human illustrations are never perfect, but I give this as an example of how so many Christians are sort of in walking with Christ like two roommates, but they've lost their passion, lost their zeal, lost their visceral love that once they had for Christ when they were excited as new believers for their salvation and the forgiveness of sins and assurance of eternal life. And they just, it's another sermon. I like this one, I don't like this one. And I think that is the coolness of that love, even though they are in the church, even though they're doing good. The Ephesian church was doing good things, and yes. They were busy, they were serving, they were guarding, they were actually discerning, believe it or not. They're teaching right doctrine and not going into the heresies that are mentioned.
We're going to take a break and continue our conversation. This new book out by Tyndale and written by Michael Youssef, God's Final Call. We'll continue the conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The procedure of debanking is a problem that needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, the problem is often ignored because leaders of financial institutions maintain that they do not deny banking services to individuals because of their political views. Now, in previous commentaries, I've talked about how Nigel Farage lost access to banking services in the UK, which he believed was due to his previous involvement in Brexit. I've quoted Mark Andreessen, who in a Joe Rogan interview said he knew 30 tech company founders who had been debanked within the past 4 years. Fortunately, I have some good news. Lathan Watts, who's the vice president of Alliance Defending Freedom, was on my radio program to talk about his article that describes how they have won a major victory against debanking. After a series of negotiations with attorneys, J.P. Morgan Chase agreed to adopt language in its code of conduct that protects against political and religious debanking. In the interview, we talked about some of the action behind the scenes. 2 years ago, for example, 19 state attorneys general and 14 state financial officers sent letters calling on Chase to provide transparency on the cancellations. Also, financial advisor David Bahnsen, who's been on my radio program, filed a shareholder resolution urging Chase to do the same. Even though the CEO of Chase denies they punish account holders for their political and religious views, he probably wanted to avoid the need to respond to that shareholder resolution. You know, if this trend continues, the problem of debanking may soon be relegated to the past as a relic of financial institution discrimination. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to know a little bit more about Dr. Michael Youssef, we, of course, have a link to Leading the Way. This book can be easily found in your local bookstore, but we have a link to it as well. God's Final Call, how the book of Revelation pulls back the veil on current events on our ultimate future. I do want to get to at least one or two of the churches for which there was no rebuke, but I thought we might just dig into at least maybe one that people are less familiar with, Pergamon, because you refer to that for justifiable reasons as the letter to the church near Satan's throne. And when we sometimes look to the past, Dr. Youssef, and we see the immorality happening there, many times in the past, maybe in the 1950s here in America, or even when you were growing up in Egypt, you say, well, that could never happen here. But we pretty much have found that issue of sexual immorality and decadence has come to the West and come to America in many ways and in very significant ways, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Well, Kerby, you know a little bit about my history. Well, I used to be part of the mainline denomination. And
yes.
40 years ago, or more than that, we fought hard, but then we basically walked away because we saw the writing on the wall. And the very language that I fought against 40 years ago is now in the evangelical church. And it's almost like the same story. It's never finished. It never varies. And, you know, the camel puts his head under the tent. Well, we'll do this women for ministry, and then with this, and then this, and then this. Almost, and now some mega evangelical churches. There's just a video came out. Literally was sneaked out. Was supposed to be confidential, just among the pastors and the lay leaders, and it's telling all their plants everywhere, you know, just accept transgender and affirm the parents, encourage the parents. They have already accepted homosexual couples as welcoming in the welcoming committee of greeters, and on and on and on and on. I mean, this is exactly the Church of Pergamum. That basically Satan is not fighting the church anymore. He's joining them. And I just came back last night, literally, from a crusade in Sydney, Australia. I had several meetings in Seoul, Korea, where I saw them getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and praying. And I spoke to the army, the Korean army, and 1,000 men came down to receive Christ just last week. And I see how the Spirit of God is moving in some areas, but then it's just like the churches, the first and the last in the book of Revelation. And then, Smyrna and Philadelphia. Ephesus. Sorry, I'm in jet lag.
Well, I can understand that.
Two churches that are thriving, and yet there is all these other churches that have just literally invited Satan to come into the church. And we're not just, Satan presides, just as he said in some of these churches. And we have really, literally, the throne of Satan is being set. And so that all basically have propelled me to write this book in terms of the relevance for our day.
Yes.
Our Lord's words are always relevant for every age and every generation. But certainly, and as you know, some of our dispensationalist friends, whom I love dearly, have kind of divided these 7 letters to historically. And so they will say, we are the Church of Laodicea, the last days. I don't argue these points, but if we are, certainly that compromise is very, very, very clear. And literally, Jesus is about to vomit us because of our lack of fervor for Him.
Yes. Well, let's see if we can talk about a positive one. And you mentioned Smyrna, and that is, of course, one of the 2 churches of the 7 that do not receive a word of rebuke. It was a suffering church, and boy, that is the letter to the churches we talk about when we have somebody here from Open Doors or Voice of the Martyrs or yourself, because that is the word that other Christians around the world certainly can relate to. But, eventually that may be coming to the United States of America.
Absolutely. I believe God has given us an opportunity right now, and I don't want to get into politics because it's not something that, but it does. I mean, all political decisions are moral decisions, but at least I believe that God has given us a reprieve from what we see is happening in Europe and Australia. I just come back from then, and it's just what I see around the world, the suffering church. We deal every day, literally, with hundreds of people from around the world because of the channel we have, Kingdom Sat, that is going into 260 million homes in the Arabic-speaking world. When people come to Christ, literally, the family want to kill them, not the government, but the family. Mm-hmm. And so there's severe persecution in some places, and yet there is severe compromise and apathy in the West. And that in itself invites persecution.
Well, let's, if we can, just before we run out of time, get to something I received from your organization today. More than 500,000 people praying daily for spiritual awakening. And you are going to be having these gatherings in Boston, just down the road from where I'm broadcasting here today, San Antonio, Washington, D.C. And there is just a real significant issue because as you talk about the challenges of lukewarmness, false gospels, apathy, we need a revival here in America.
Amen. That's the burden of my heart. I owe so much to this country. I'm so grateful to be an adopted, my adopted country. And I always tell people I'm not a hyphenated American. When I came here, I wanted to be part of it. I want to be I want to be grateful, and I want to express that gratitude. So 4 years ago, we began asking people to sign up only if they're serious about praying daily for an awakening. My friendship with Dr. J. Edwin Orr goes back to 1977 and 78 when I lived in California, and I spent time with him, and I read his books and about the 2 great awakenings that we've experienced, and it's been a burning in my heart for all those years, nearly 40 years, 50 years actually, is to see a 3rd great awakening. And so I began 4 years ago to ask viewers and listeners, would you commit? And I was overwhelmed that we had 500,000 people literally committing to pray for an awakening. And then came the burden of my going on the road and literally having a great awakening, prayer, encouragement, support. I want to be the servant of the church. I want to serve. I'm 77 this year. I'm giving it my best. My foot is on the accelerator because I don't know how long I've got. And so I am burdened to see that this great country that has done so much for the world, and I'm talking from not just economics, but the spiritual, the missionaries that have gone from here, the money that went out supporting mission work around the world.
Yes.
And therefore, I have a burden to see that the Lord sends a third great awakening that will literally, but it's going to start in the church. It's going to start by a revival. And when the week I spent in Seoul, Korea was very challenging. And as I told you, I just got back last night from there. Is that they are praying church. And no wonder they went from 3% Christians to nearly 42% Christians now.
Wow.
Which and really God is using so many Christian leaders in an amazing way. And so I just long to, and I'm zealous to see this for this great country that has been a blessing to me personally. So I don't want to take the blessings for granted. I want to give back, and the Great Awakening series that we'll be preaching around the different cities for 26 and 27, 28, if the Lord doesn't come back or take me home, is that part of that burden. And thank you for sharing that.
Well, again, we can encourage people to go to LTW, standing for Leading the Way, ltw.org. Find out about the book, God's Final Call. Of course, you can find out more about Awake America. Of course, you can watch all of the videos there. We also, of course, have a link to Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest. And so, Dr. Michael Youssef, probably need to encourage you to get some rest. And nothing else, we are grateful that you are willing to join us today here on Point of View.
I am very grateful to you, Brother Kerby. Thank you so much.
Let's take a break. And again, the book is entitled God's Final Call, How the Book of Revelation Pulls Back the Veil on Current Events and Our Ultimate Future. And really, it is, if you think about it, a spiritual diagnosis of our churches today and of where Christianity is worldwide. And you can find all sorts of examples in those 7 churches and those 7 letters. And so if you're not familiar, this is a book that has been out for about a month. There has been some great material that I've been able to watch on all certain broadcast channels, and I think you will find it very helpful, and I would encourage you to get a copy. And we have a link to all of that on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, one of the articles we've posted for you is entitled The Columnist as a Moral Compass. It is actually a review that Noah Gould has done of a book by Peggy Noonan. Of course, I've known Peggy Noonan, had a chance a while back when she was in Dallas to introduce her to a group. And we're going to be talking about more than just her columns, just the whole idea of looking at some of these moral and Judeo-Christian principles. And that certainly fits because Noah Gould is the alumni and student programs manager at the Acton Institute. The Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty is one I've quoted from many times, founded there in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and really kind of promotes Judeo-Christian ideas. We oftentimes have quoted some of the things that they have done over the years in terms of the free market with Jay Richards and a variety of others, going all the way back to Robert Sirico. So a great organization, but also in addition to being at the Acton Institute, also contributor to Young Voices. So Noah, welcome to Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for having me.
Well, let's get into this because sometimes, and I've done this a few times myself, trying to summarize a book that has a series of like newspaper columns, and I've done this before in some of my commentaries, a little bit of a challenge, but you chose to make it a little broader than just the story of Peggy Noonan, who, by the way, if you're not familiar, was the speechwriter, for example, for Ronald Reagan, and of course, oftentimes here on our Friday weekend edition, Penna Dexter will quote a Peggy Noonan column that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, but you wanted to kind of look at this broader issue of how those of us, like yourself and myself and others, how we in some respects can provide maybe a moral reflection on what is happening in our culture.
Yeah, and I really think this is what sets Peggy's work apart in this space of having to, make comments on events as they unfold. This book covers about 7 years of events, really kind of two presidencies, President Trump and then President Biden. And what really sets her apart, and I think can be emulated by writers, is that strong moral voice and the way that she is trying to dig deeper into national identity and how the different events of the day reflect that and what kind of standard we should be holding ourselves to.
Well, and again, I might just mention for just a minute, Peggy Noonan, probably best known for a couple of the speeches. You mentioned one, of course, the Challenger explosion. You can kind of think of some of those seminal events where Ronald Reagan would kind of want to rekindle some patriotic fervor or to focus some attention or time on a particular issue. And in some respects, I do get the sense that Peggy Noonan and many of us lament that, as you point out, this set of 80-some-odd op-eds could be called the tale of two presidents, Donald Trump's first term and Joe Biden's only term. And those aren't exactly the same kind of individuals that, say, Ronald Reagan was or some of the great orators in the past have been. And so in some respects, you get a little bit of a sense of lament in some of her writings, don't you?
Yes, exactly. I think she does a fair job of calling balls and strikes, trying to keep it about the policies, what she agrees with, what she disagrees with. And she's certainly no fan of either president. And she continually calls it back through stories of history, like you mentioned, the Challenger explosion, linking events of today to a larger narrative. But she continually calls it back to ideas of character and how she sees that as really, you can't unlink character from the policies that we see kind of being implemented. So character for her is a much broader thing than just kind of individual characteristics.
Well, and again, we recognize that sometimes we would love to have a person running for office that's of great character, who also is firm on the very significant principles, those first principles that guide him or her, and then also in some respects, if it's a governor or president, also good at choosing and managing people beneath them. Lately, we've not exactly gotten 3 for 3. If you get 1 for 3, sometimes we feel we're pretty good, but it's illustrative, I think, again, of what at least we desire to have and what we aspire to. And I think that comes through her writings and really some of the writings of those of you there at the Acton Institute.
Yeah, certainly. I want to acknowledge that politics is kind of the art of the possible, so I don't want to make it sound like Peggy or myself are making this kind of argument for something that's impossible. But yes, those ideals matter. She uses the example of the Uvalde shooting, the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas, and
right.
the lack of professional character, lack of professional ethics that was on display there. And so it's character borne out in these larger things that happen. And so there's all these forming institutions that in society help shape the way people are. Of course, the family is the first place that happens. The church is also necessary for that kind of formation. And there's all these other little institutions that are necessary to form the type of character that we would then be able to see the courage we need in those moments of tragedy.
You know, one of the other things, since, of course, we were talking about the character of the individuals in office, and I'm not saying that all are disreputable. We have certainly many times been able to focus on some people that do have great character and are the kind of individuals you want your children and grandchildren to emulate. But there's another aspect of that, and it came out as she was talking about the empty office buildings represent and reveal an air of post-greatness. And then says it's like an Edward Hopper painting showing empty streets, tables for one, everyone at the bar drinking alone. But there is a sense in which, even apart from maybe we long for the kind of politician who would be a statesman, the kind of individual that would be a leader in corporate America that would lead us back to greatness, there's still that desire for that. And it's illustrated by the fact that Donald Trump figured out early on, make America great again. And then even talking about America's golden age. And even when he first ran, he was, I think, seeing some things that a lot of people were just taking for granted. And that is, he said, you look at airports, and when I travel overseas, we were just talking with Michael Youssef, and you think of some of the airports in places like Australia and South Korea. I can think of airports like in Zurich, Switzerland, and other places where I've been, beautiful airports. And then you go to some of ours that are really kind of embarrassing. The other day, I'm driving down the road in a road that is in North Dallas, which is more affluent, and yet it's a road that to me looked like something I'd see in a third world country. So whether you're talking about the character of individuals who are leaders, or just in some respects sort of the rundown nature of some of the infrastructure in America, there is a sense in which we sort of long for something that will bring us back to the, if you will, the halcyon period of the country, and we're kind of living into what she calls post-greatness.
Yes, absolutely. I think the core of a few of the things that you brought up is going back to what is the purpose of that area of society more specifically. So, you mentioned business, these empty offices. Part of this loss of faith in business is, what is the purpose of business and what is the value that business people can bring to the table in solving real problems that people have? But then what are the problems that business can't solve? And I think some of the disappointment in business and that era of post-greatness is because people want business to do things that they honestly should have their church provide, like community. Business is really good at solving people's problems, but it's not good at being that core community that people need. Likewise, you mentioned the roads. I mean, that's a fundamental thing that we need to be asking governments to do, and that's just a basic purpose of government, is to provide those types of common goods. And so back again to this problem of, we've mixed up what the purpose of government is. We look at it to solve all of our problems. Instead, we should look more narrowly and say, this is a specific problem, the roads, that government should and needs to solve.
We need to take a break. When we come back, though, since you are one of the individuals with young voices, I'd like to get your perspective in that regard, because the younger you are in America, according to some of these polls, the less likely you are to have great, you point out, the failure to understand what your role is and maybe trying to do too much, and to think that government is all more about DEI and ESG and affirmative action, instead of making sure that you could put out fires in Southern California, or making sure that you at least have the roads that are functional. And in some respects, I'd love to get your perspective, since we oftentimes do a millennial roundtable, what you would say are maybe some of the reasons why that feeling of post-greatness is causing a problem in terms of people respect and even patriotism for this country. So we'll come back and talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Noah Gould. And again, we talk about his piece, The Columnist, his moral compass, talking about Peggy Noonan. But I thought it was interesting because in many cases, she's talking about these issues from a moral perspective, moral distinctions, moral guide rails, and the rest. And one example you use is, for instance, she strongly defends capitalism, as do we around this table, but then excoriates tech leaders. And you go on to say, at the deepest level, her religious convictions also ground her critiques in history and tradition, not just her moralizing opinions. And it does seem to me that, as again, this brings you back to everything from the Ethics and Public Policy Center to the Axton Institute and a number of others. These were founded by individuals that felt we were missing something. You can talk about in the political realm that we have the idea of a representative form of government. In the economic realm, we have a free market. But it's like a three-legged stool. You need one other leg to that, and that is a Judeo-Christian morality. And it does seem to me that even though she's maybe looking at it in a little different religious perspective than some of us, she's onto something, and your article was sort of onto something, that if indeed we try to just provide a critique without looking back at the moral principles, I think we're missing something.
Yeah, absolutely. This is some of the problem of those who might defend capitalism or just a market economy of free exchange without understanding ethics and a really clear vision of morality. Because without that morality and the formation that I talked about that individuals need, then freedom is just a vacuum, and that's going to reflect the choices that different people have. So without virtue, freedom just becomes anarchy and it becomes a dangerous place to be. But then without freedom, of course, people can't make choices to be virtuous. So you need both of those things. You mentioned the three-legged stool analogy as well. These are things that need to balance each other, and without them, we're going in a negative direction as a country.
Well, and again, that's the point that you certainly make so often there. It's a free market economic policy, but it's framed within this idea of a Judeo-Christian morality. And maybe now, if I can come back to something I talked about just before I went to the break, the younger you are sometimes in America, the less likely you are to have this kind of sense of pride or patriotistic fervor or appreciation. And I think some of that is because there is a general skepticism by younger generations about institutions in general, and whether it's the institution of government, whether it's the institution of the corporate world, or even the institution of the church. It does seem to me that as an individual that writes for Young Voices, it seems that many of these young voices are really very skeptical and fairly critical of almost every institution in America today. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just on that cusp between millennial and Gen Z, and you do see this kind of loss of faith in institutions. What are institutions for or against us? That's a repeating problem you see people give some variation of. And if I could just go in a kind of a personal direction, I don't think these trends are inevitable, right? I think there are a large number of people who are unhappy with the way their life is going, and I've written on how do we restore civil society, how do we bring back a perspective of joining, of membership. In my own life, I'm a member of a church, and that membership isn't limiting. It opens up all these opportunities for community and friendship and deep connections. Likewise, I'm married, I have 2 little kids, and in some ways that limits me. There are certain things that I can't do because I'm home with the kids. But a proper understanding of freedom, recognizing that that's actually increasing the connection and joy in my life in so many ways. And so my response to some of those trends is to recognize nothing's inevitable, and how can we encourage young people, get married, join a church, join a club. These are things that I do think people have a innate desire for. They might not know where to direct that desire, but I just always try to encourage my peers. These are the positive things, and these are good things that you should be pursuing in life.
Well, and again, that does get back to Edmund Burke, the idea of the little platoons, and maybe we need to encourage young people to join more things, to be joiners, rather than to lament that they feel lonely. I'm thinking of the book that came out many years ago, Bowling Alone, and the argument is that people used to join bowling groups and bowling teams. Not that I'm encouraging people necessarily do that now, but that all has changed, and joining various groups in your community. Of course, even joining the church are sort of changing because so many young people are starting to be unaffiliated, the so-called nuns, atheist, agnostic, no preference. And so in some respects, there are some ways back, and part of it is that government needs to do what it is best to do. It should know how to put out fires. It should know how to build roads. It should know how to make sure that the planes land. Business needs to be best at producing goods and services, not get involved in all sorts of woke sidetracking. And we as individuals need to be joiners rather than live isolated lives. And it seems to me that if you want to find your way back, those are at least a few things that come to mind of what we can do to make our lives and our culture and our society better.
Absolutely, and what a good note to discuss as far as we've talked about national decline and these trends, but I do think there's a note of hope here and encouraging people to take these steps.
Let me just mention that we do have the article here. It originally appeared in the Washington Free Beacon, so you can find it there if you'd like, but we have a link there. So first of all, you can find out a little bit more about the book that you have dealt with, and that is Peggy Noonan's A Certain Idea of America. But if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things Noah is doing, of course, you can also go to the links we've provided in the past for Young Voices. So appreciate you being with us. And if somebody would like to contact you, have you come and speak, or like to know a little bit more about what you're doing at the Acton Institute, what kind of link should we provide for them?
Yeah, feel free to connect with me on now X, probably Twitter, Noah C. Gould 1. I'd love to chat there, and we can see where the conversation goes.
Okay, well, we do have a link to that right now, so it is on the website at pointofview.net. So, Noah, thank you for joining us. We've had a number of people from Young Voices. Of course, we have a Millennial Roundtable. I actually had that yesterday, and we'll probably call on you and others for that conversation. But thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
We are going to come back, and I'm going to once again take a little bit of a time to try to express a few issues related to tariffs. Got a good piece by Gerard Baker. I've quoted from him before, and he is very critical, as evidenced by the title, Trump is Trashing America's Reputation, which he's talking about maybe, if you will, the brand identity of the whole nation as a large. And then a piece by Mark Lewis, if tariffs don't work, why do other countries tariff the U.S.? Which was interesting, a question asked just the other day by the Secretary of Treasury, but then also gives us an example. I gave you one the other day about the Great Depression, but he also gives one in terms of the war between the states, which goes back to tariffs. And then we're going to get into a couple of other issues. A very good piece by our good friend Gary Bauer on media malfeasance. And some of you have been asking, so I guess I'll get into it. We have a question about whether or not a Muslim city or compound should be built in the state of Texas. That kind of local story has become a national story. And so what about this? And would that lead to Sharia law and a variety of other things? So we've got some very important topics to address in the second hour. But first of all, let me encourage you to go to the website to find some of the material we've just talked about. My Viewpoints commentary today on debanking and lots more. We'll cover the rest of that right after these important messages.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join the conversation, we'll open up the phones in just a few minutes. But since I was not on yesterday, I thought I would mention this today on Tuesday, that there were 1,300 demonstrations around the country protesting various things. It could be DOGE, it could be deportations, it could be DEI being withdrawn, it could be tariffs. It's what I call the DDT, because some of these D's or the T are controversial. And, of course, a lot of that has to do with a number of other issues related to that. And so the theme of these demonstrations has been hands off. I mean, the idea is hands off our government, hands off illegal aliens, hands off our abortion rights, hands off of transgender kids. And so, as you might imagine, Gary Bauer, who I'm going to quote from a little bit later in his article, said, well, I got some hands-off ideas. How about hands off our kids? Quit lying to them and telling them there's 52 different genders. Hands off our Second Amendment rights, our right to own a gun. Hands off free speech. Quit trying to censor us. Hands off of our religious freedom. Quit trying to restrict it and force faith back into the closet. Hands off of our border wall. Stop fighting against every effort to actually secure the border. Hands off innocent, defenseless preborn children. Stop killing babies inside the womb in our future. Hands off businesses. Stop pushing regulations that make it impossible to make a profit. Hands off our police. Stop handcuffing the good guys so they can lock up the bad guys. And hands off our money. Stop wasting our hard-earned tax dollars. So that was his response to the hands-off program. And if you have some people that are really into the hands-off program, the 1,300 different, and by the way, these are very coordinated protests around the country, maybe you can say, well, you've got some hands off, we've got a few hands off that we might recommend ourselves. One of those, though, is the issue of tariffs, and I thought it would be worthwhile once again to give you two kind of different looks at this issue. The first is by Gerard Baker, in which he tells the story at the very beginning. It was very heartwarming that after Japan actually surrendered at the end of World War II, it turns out that his father was a young boy living in a small town, and I thought it was intriguing. I guess it was the Japanese colleague told him about his father. So anyway, there is this young boy who then later told him about the fact that when the American troops moved in to occupy their country, they were panicked because, if you're not familiar, the amount of propaganda that came from Imperial Japan was horrific, and saying that the Americans would murder and rape and pillage individuals, that these were the devils from hell and all that. So, nevertheless, this story that was told to his father from this individual who at the time had been a young boy says that when the American trucks rolled through the town, he and his family just cowered indoors. They were expecting the worst, and they watched the GIs jump out of the vehicles, placed heavy boxes on the street, and they thought, well, then this must be some terrible weapon, poisonous gas, booby-trapped or something. But then the troops left, and the boxes were there, and at least some of the more brave and curious kids opened them up, and inside were layers and layers of chocolate bars, candy, all sorts of things that some of these near-starving Japanese kids had never seen in their young lives because they had been there during the war that had taken place. And he says, in some respects, those are some illustrations of the fact that you can really be proud sometimes of what America has done. And so the United States not only used its economic power and its military power to advance its interest, it also used values and morality, which we just talked about a few minutes ago with Noah Gould, and we really were an example of commitment to human dignity. And so the point he's making is that America sometimes has a bad image. He doesn't go into it, but I will. When you travel overseas, you recognize there is a stereotype of the ugly American, and I sometimes wish some Americans would stay home because they aren't necessarily the best representative of America. But that being said, as you just heard last hour, Michael Youssef appreciates the fact that he is in America, always wanted to come to America, was looking forward to being an American, and didn't even want to be seen as a hyphenated American. He's an American. And so the American brand still has some value. And he reminds us, that is Gerard Baker, that, you know, everybody from BlackBerry to Bud Light know that sometimes you can lose your brand pretty easily, and that can be devastating. And his argument is right now, because we have some of these tariffs, some of our pro-American friends, and he says from Canada to Denmark to Poland, are upset with us. And in some respects, the question is what are we going to do to maybe mitigate against that? Or to use the word we used on Friday, to mollify some of the concerns people have. And so he says, behavior damages more than our moral standing in the world. It can be actively counterproductive. And he reminds us, as he ends there, the Romans had a saying, let them hate us as long as they fear us. But part of a superpower that has been admired can do both, he says. In the end, unfortunately, the Romans discovered you don't want to be around when they still hate you, but they no longer fear you. And so I think his argument is we have to be careful about our reputation. And if we come off with these tariffs as looking like a bully, that won't be good. My counter to that, before I get to the next article we'll read after the break, is that I don't know that we've done that much damage to our, quote, brand yet, as evidenced by the fact that maybe they just fear us and they don't respect us. But the bottom line is, if you listen to the current Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, he says there are now 70 different countries that have contacted the United States that say we want to make a deal. Some have already unilaterally said we're going to drop our tariffs. We got away with those tariffs for a long time, but now that we know you're serious, we better drop them pretty quickly if we want to still have Americans buy our products. But there are others that maybe say, well, we still need to protect certain industries, and I understand that. But the bottom line is that tariffs could be a way to get everyone's attention. The problem, and I get this from another article which I didn't post, but it's one that you can easily find. There are some commentators that have gone through and pointed out that everybody in the Trump administration right now needs to get on the same page. And as one commentator put it, one minute we hear that these tariffs are temporary just to try to get the attention of some of these countries. Then others say, no, they're permanent. Some say that they are really an attempt to deal with unfairness and reciprocity. Others say, no, it's a way in which to protect American industry. And again, I recognize there are different answers to each tariff in each country. But right now, you are getting a very definite mixed message from some of the people going out in the talking head shows. And if the Trump administration wants to do anything, let's come back to everybody singing off the same song sheet. That would be very effective. Let's look at a different way of looking at tariffs by going to this piece by Mark Lewis, and we'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The procedure of debanking is a problem that needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, the problem is often ignored because leaders of financial institutions maintain that they do not deny banking services to individuals because of their political views. Now, in previous commentaries, I've talked about how Nigel Farage lost access to banking services in the UK, which he believed was due to his previous involvement in Brexit. I've quoted Mark Andreessen, who in a Joe Rogan interview said he knew 30 tech company founders who had been debanked within the past 4 years. Fortunately, I have some good news. Lathan Watts, who's the vice president of Alliance Defending Freedom, was on my radio program to talk about his article that describes how they have won a major victory against debanking. After a series of negotiations with attorneys, J.P. Morgan Chase agreed to adopt language in its code of conduct that protects against political and religious debanking. In the interview, we talked about some of the action behind the scenes. 2 years ago, for example, 19 state attorneys general and 14 state financial officers sent letters calling on Chase to provide transparency on the cancellations. Also, financial advisor David Bahnsen, who's been on my radio program, filed a shareholder resolution urging Chase to do the same. Even though the CEO of Chase denies they punish account holders for their political and religious views, he probably wanted to avoid the need to respond to that shareholder resolution. You know, if this trend continues, the problem of debanking may soon be relegated to the past as a relic of financial institution discrimination. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemicalabortion. Viewpoints.info/chemicalabortion. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk about tariffs for a few more minutes. And then I thought, just because there have been a number of people asking me this question, what about these resurrected wolves? And that's Romulus and Remus. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll get to that in just a minute, which is a good reason to get my booklet on a biblical point of view on genetic engineering, because you can understand how they were able to do that. As one wag said the other day, first it's the wolves, then it's the dinosaurs. Are we headed for Jurassic Park? I don't know. We'll get to that in just a minute. But let me finish off the tariffs issue first. And that is the second article I've given to you. And again, I would encourage you to read these, because we're, doing our best to try to sort through all the different messages and mixed messages here. But Mark Lewis says, let me say up front that I don't know if Trump's tariffs will accomplish his purposes or not. Tariffs are common in human history. Some tariffs in some places at certain times have had benefits to countries' economy. Other tariffs have been utter disasters. And so his title is, If Tariffs Don't Work, Why Do Other Countries Tariff the U.S.? And the bottom line is that was a question asked the other day by the Secretary of Treasury when he was doing an interview, because they are used. Now, it's interesting because Mark Lewis, even though he wears a cowboy hat and looks pretty Western now, for a while actually lived in South Korea back in the 1990s, and points out that it was almost impossible to see any car on the road except a Kia or a Hyundai. And that is because the South Korean government put very high, he calls them outrageous tariffs on foreign cars. And the purpose was to encourage Koreans to buy Kias and Hyundais, which the Koreans did. And, of course, now you don't have any kind of limit because, of course, we just the other day announced that Hyundai is going to build a significant Hyundai plant here in the United States. And isn't that the plant where they're also talking about building a steel mill nearby for the steel that they need? So bringing auto manufacturing to the United States, bringing steel manufacturing back to the United States, very good. But he also goes on after telling that story, it's difficult to deny that Kia and Hyundai and many subsidiary businesses in Korea, those that service those two companies, were benefited by the tariff. That, in doubt, is part of what Mr. Trump hopes to accomplish with the tariffs. So he recognizes sometimes they can have some beneficial and negative consequences. And he points out that you can also, if you really want to be honest, say that these tariffs in the past really played a significant role in the great disasters in U.S. history. The first is the war between the states. Won't go into all the details of it, but he talks about the fact that really for the first 70 years of American history, North and South argued and compromised over the tariff. The North, moving into shipping and especially industry, wanted a high tariff because they wanted to protect themselves against the cheaper, more well-established goods that were coming from Europe. The South, totally almost agricultural, wanted as many cheap European products as they could get, and of course wanted to be able to sell those as well. And so you had a situation, for those of you that are students of history, back in 1830, recognize this as 35 years, 30 years at least before the Civil War, 35 years before the end of the Civil War, for when South Carolina almost seceded over what was called the Tariff of Abominations. But then fast forward, of course, 30 years, and in 1860, the Republican Party, which was more of a northern party, won the presidency, won both houses of Congress, and immediately passed the highest tariff in American history at that point. The southern states, at least 7 of them, seceded, and they feared that Republicans in Congress would try to use their power to abolish slavery. But in some respects, you could say that was maybe not even the primary issue. What certainly was part of that was secession. And he uses as an illustration of that the fact that 2 of these southern states that were seceding mentioned the tariff in their articles of secession. And so in some respects, as soon as the corporate states of America were formed, guess what they did? Well, they formed a government that passed a low tariff. Then, of course, we the other day talked about, and I've got a commentary coming out soon. Matter of fact, it may be coming out tomorrow if I've looked at the calendar. If not, it'll be Thursday, on the whole issue of Smoot-Hawley. And that one, again, it wasn't like it was all of that, but it was much of that. You had the stock market collapse in 1929. Then you had the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930. And that, again, led to some of this. So the point that he is making is that it's understandable why many of these countries have tariffs, and it's understandable why Donald Trump would want to eliminate them. But it is, if you will, a high wire act. That is, there is very little margin for error for a couple of reasons. First of all, you cannot necessarily expect that the federal judiciary is going to want to follow the Constitution. We've seen this with the deportations and also with DOJ in a little bit, where one federal judge, maybe even in a minor area, is able to, with an injunction, shut down the entire country. And so whether it has been everything from building the wall at the border, deportations, the various cuts through DOJ, or now tariffs, that's one issue. The other issue in terms of margin of error is that, yes, you did have 2 Republicans that were elected out of Florida, but nevertheless, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, really doesn't have a lot to work with. It's a very little margin for error, and so there's a lot that can go wrong. Just look at the stock market over the last couple of days, and it's going to take a lot to go right for some of the things that Donald Trump and his Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Treasury, and others would want to accomplish. So I'm not going to be quite as dogmatic, nor do I think we need to be, given the fact that different individuals, some of whom we've interviewed on this program, come to different conclusions about these tariffs. But nevertheless, I wanted you to once again see just a few of the things that are coming out about this issue, and we will certainly continue following that in the future. But maybe to lighten it up for just a minute, I thought I've had a few people saying, what about these wolves? Because if you're not familiar, we have what's called the dire wolf. And I guess I can show a picture of this, a wolf, for those of you watching online. And they also got a picture of somebody from Jurassic Park. Because what you have here is the possibility of extracting from the DNA of some of these fossilized remains enough material using what's called CRISPR. I won't go into that, but you can get my little booklet on a biblical point of view on genetics, which I talk about that. And so you have now these particular wolves that went extinct that now have been brought back. And again, these are called Romulus and Remus, again, named for, of course, Rome. And they're the first animals ever resurrected from extinction. And, of course, it has to happen fairly recently. They argue that they were lost to history about 10,000 years ago, although one wag said, wait a minute, I think they're only 6,000 years old, so I won't get into that whole issue. But nevertheless, they were reborn in October of this last year, and the pups are brought to life. And so it does hold for the possibility, if you can get viable DNA out, that you could actually then use that to resurrect some of these extinct animals. How much and how far down the road we want to go with that is dependent on a couple of things. First of all, our technological ability, which seems to be better than it's ever been. And number two, the availability of something that is viable DNA. The argument that would be made is that, well, the dinosaurs have been gone for so long, we don't have viable DNA. But I did make a kind of an offhanded comment to the young Earth creationists, because I've had some of our young Earth creationists point out that they have found some what look like and seem to be dinosaur bones, but when they open up the bones, the internal material is still viable, which, of course, suggests that maybe they're not as old as we think they are, which I think is a very powerful argument, but also would suggest the possibility that you could maybe use that to reconstruct a dinosaur, if indeed those are viable. My only recommendation is, yeah, Apatosaurus, yes. Don't bring back the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Just don't want that. If you saw the movie, we've seen the movie, we don't know what that would bring. Matter of fact, we see how it ends, and it's never good. But nevertheless, some of you wondering about this, at first people were thinking, oh, this is just fake news. But apparently we have been able to bring back these dire wolves back from the dead. And even though they were extinct, we now have two. We'll see where we go from that, but it's an intriguing scientific breakthrough. I thought we'd talk about it here on Point of View. We'll be back right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can get into an issue that has been local and now kind of become national. And so I've posted this article by Sarah Arnold, and that is what is entitled, again, the governor of the state of Texas issues a strong warning over a controversial Muslim city proposal. Now, again, you've got to sort of begin to think first principles here. Would it be possible for an individual that is either Muslim or Buddhist or or Christian or whatever, to establish a place that would be friendly to organizations or to people of the same religion. That's one thing. When the development is actually one that has been portrayed as being a self-contained community, and where there are at least some documents that talk about that community then would be governed by its own set of laws and governance, that's when all of a sudden the lights start flashing. Now, again, that could simply mean that we want to make sure that the grounds are mowed and we have an HOA that fits within all the guidelines of the city. That's one thing. But because we're talking about a Muslim group, does that mean Sharia law? And so this has become kind of an issue. And a while back, I was contacted by our friends at American Family Radio, wanted me to speak to it. And I said, well, first of all, I want to find out some more, because you can think of the extremes sometimes when there has been an attempt to establish a compound based upon complete unified religious views. You can think of the Rajneeshis in Eastern Oregon, or even down south here, you can think of the Branch Davidians in Waco. Those didn't turn out so well. You can think of other times in which people said, look, I want to have a Christian community, I want to have a Christian camp. That works fine. And so there's a sense in which trying to sort all of that out is a little bit difficult. And nevertheless, at the moment, the Texas Governor Greg Abbott has blocked the construction of this Muslim majority city in the state of Texas, even though it has been backed by various investors with a Muslim background. And this was established and begun by what is called the East Plano Islamic Center. Now, you can go on Wikipedia. They've got a lot of visibility right now because they also have the East Plano Islamic Center EPIC and its plans to construct a Muslim neighborhood. And at the moment, it has been halted because of certain legal complications. But again, the plan was to have like a 1,000 home settlement, which would be in round numbers about 40 minutes from Dallas. The community would include a mosque, a faith-based Muslim school, maybe even a community college, a shopping center, a sporting facility. And so the argument against it has been we have laws against Sharia law. As a matter of fact, one of the things that the governor wrote is, to be clear, Sharia law is not allowed in Texas, nor are Sharia cities, nor are no-go zones, which the project seems to imply. Now, is that an overreaction? Well, the critics of the governor or the supporters of the East Plano Islamic Center say, look, this is just racial profiling that you're engaged in. You're against them simply because they're Muslim. Yes, that's possible. And the reason some people have raised the issue is because we've seen what happens in other countries. You would hope in the United States that that wouldn't happen, but when you have the governor talking about Sharia law, Sharia cities, or even this phrase no-go zones, there are places you can find both in France and now, unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, in England, that are basically no-go zones. The police tend to stay out of those areas, and mostly Sharia law is used primarily if they're trying to stay under the government edicts. Sharia law may be for the civil service, but not maybe the criminal laws. But nevertheless, you can see why there's an issue. And again, for those that maybe up until now said, it's just really crazy that you people are even worried about Sharia law. The Sharia law that was passed in Texas was signed back in 2017. And about that same period of time, maybe a little bit after, I did a booklet on Sharia law for all of our donors. I'm thinking I might update that one, because back then we were pointing out that there were a couple of states, Oklahoma being first, Texas and a couple others, passing a law preventing Sharia law being used within the court system. And the argument that we were receiving at the time from individuals was, you are trying to actually provide a remedy for a problem that does not exist. And so that's where I took some time to quote from a very good book that was put together at the time by Frank Gaffney, who's been on the program before, in which he cites dozens and dozens of cases, even back then, in which Sharia law was referred to in court decisions. That's why it's probably time to update that, because you have a lot of things that have changed dramatically. First of all, the way in which some of those laws have been interpreted, say, in the state of Michigan. Dearborn, Michigan, up until recently, has been probably the place where you've had the highest percentage of Muslims in the United States. Of course, you can also talk about Somalis in Minnesota, but as I've heard from people that know a lot more about this than I do, the greatest concentration of Muslims now is not in Dearborn, Michigan. It's in Tampa, Florida, which would have surprised me. But nevertheless, those are the kinds of things that we are hearing. So again, don't want to overreact to it, but I did want to at least address this issue, because what do you do when an individual or a group of individuals want to band together? We recognize that if somebody wanted to have a Christian gathering, but not exclude individuals who were not Christian, we would see that as permissible. But if you had a situation, and somebody the other day said, well, they're only getting upset because they're Muslims. No, if you had Christians saying, no, I want to establish a Christian center and only Christians can live there, I think that would actually be something that would be as controversial, because it would be discriminatory. And if you can't see that, just imagine if somebody said, I like white Americans, so I want to just have, we'll call it a white settlement. By the way, we happen to have a city here in Texas called White Settlement. But let's say you wanted to have a white settlement or a white compound. Would you think that was wrong? Of course you would. And so there is a sense in which people are wanting to know a little bit more about a settlement that has a mosque, it has a Muslim school, it has a community college, has a shopping center, sporting facility, and 1,000 homes. You'd wonder what that might mean. And what is happening in the state of Texas maybe gives us an idea of what might happen or could happen in other communities around the country. Don't want to be anti-Muslim, but at the same time, if you are a Muslim listening to this program right now, you've got to maybe begrudgingly admit that some Muslims, especially radical Muslims, have given Islam a bad name, and you can see why there has been such a concern. So nevertheless, I wanted to post this for you. It goes into some detail, looks at some of the different kind of investigations into this Muslim-dominated development, the questions about whether or not they would impose Sharia law within the community. Would you be teaching about Sharia law? Probably. Within the faith-based school, the Muslim school. Would you be teaching about Islam and Sharia law? Probably. In the community college you want to develop? Probably that would be the case. And right now it's been held up simply because the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has found that many of the required permits have not been fulfilled. And so the argument is that they must confirm within 7 days that they are going to be ceasing the construction of their project, or else we're going to be headed to the courts. And so if you've heard about this in the news, recognize you're going to get all sorts of spin. I've tried to be as kind of balanced and careful as I can, but I do predict that this will, I don't think that the East Plano Islamic School and Church and Center are backing down. So I think it's going to end up in the courtrooms. And once it ends up in the courts, then once again, you will see how biased or objective the media might be, which sets me up for what we're going to talk about after the break, because our good friend Gary Bauer has written a piece called Media Malfeasance, reminding us that if you see it in a newspaper, you watch it on a TV program, you read it on an internet site, may not necessarily be the whole truth. And so it's important for us to have a level of discernment. But this is our third article. And of course, Gary Bowers is our fourth article. And I would encourage you to read it because sooner or later, probably sooner, you're going to probably hear about it in your news. And we'll keep talking about it here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that one of our other articles is by our good friend Gary Bauer. I just heard about it the other day when I was reading his end-of-day report, and so we've posted it here. It's called Media Malfeasance, and it's just one more reminder, and it's a good way to end the program today by the fact that just because you see it in a newspaper, just because you see it in a book, just because you see it on a website, just because you hear it on a radio program, just because you see it on a television program, doesn't make it necessarily true. We encourage you to check it out. You will notice that every single day we post a series of articles on Point of View, and you can click on that button that says See More, and you can see all the information about the book by Michael Youssef. You can see the article by Noah Gould. You can see two different ones on tariffs, the one about the Texas governor warning about the Muslim city, and this one on media malfeasance. You can see my commentary today, which is about the debanking victory, which we talked about about recently with Lathan Watts. And I might just mention we were going to launch today our Take Action item. We had a glitch, so we'll launch it on Friday, so be watching for that. And we give you as much facts and information as possible. Every once in a while, we post something, find out it's not true, and we try to update you with that and clarify that and correct it. But that isn't always the case. If you're not familiar, here's some numbers you can write down if you got something to write with. If you think about this, basically 6 corporations in America own 90% of the media outlets. 6%, 6 corporations own 90%. And do you think that they probably are answering to the corporation that owns them? I think you know the answer to that. And again, in some respects, who do we answer to? Well, you do, because you are our supporters and you are the people that make this possible. And so in some respects, that's why I just think it's important for you to have a significant level of discernment, maybe skepticism and the rest. And so Gary Bauer starts with this. He says, several years ago, Donald Trump created a minor controversy when he called the media the enemy of the people. And, of course, a lot of the journalists couldn't appreciate that as well. But Gary then goes on in some detail, talks about the fact that today's media are not trying to inform. They're trying to misinform and indoctrinate. That's malfeasance that makes them enemies of the people. Now, again, that may be painting with a little bit broader brush than I would, because I recognize that I have met some very professional people try to do a good job. But you know what? They also are looking at those ideas from their worldview. And it would be helpful if somebody was looking at these ideas from a consistent biblical worldview, even so. So sometimes they are, in some respects, really trying to change your mind. And in other cases, they're just trying to tell a story, but it comes from their worldview. But then he goes through this list, and I'll just give you the short list of all the lies that we've heard. He says, for example, the media lied to us about the Russian collusion hoax, insisting without evidence that Trump was a Russian asset and traitor to America. The media lied to us saying Trump praised neo-Nazi when he actually condemned them. Media lied about the COVID pandemic, saying anyone who thinks the Chinese virus came out of the Wuhan lab is a kook. Talked about that recently when we talked about the book by Senator Tom Cotton, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. He says media lied about Trump mocking our dead war heroes. Of course, that was wrong as well. Media lied to us about Hunter Biden's laptop. They said it was Russian disinformation. And then he reminds us of how in the last 4 years, under the Biden-Harris administration, you had the fewest press conferences of any president in modern history. That's a verifiable fact. And few that he did were highly scripted, and he gives you some links to show that. And then there was a obvious cover-up of mental decline. And now, don't you love this? Without much shame at all, some of those same journalists who were hiding it are now making money off of their malfeasance, he says, because now we have at least 2 books that have been written by big media personalities on how Biden's mental decline was being covered up. But if you brought that up, say, even a year and a half ago, you would be in a lot of trouble. And when the Wall Street Journal raised that question, they were pilloried beyond even imagination. But nevertheless, it's a case. And so here it says it's a real shame there were no reporters around the last 4 years who might have done some real journalism and told us the truth instead of lying about Biden's condition. So, and he goes on to say that while Donald Trump is trying to make our streets safe, the media is going to the mat for illegal alien gang members, telling us that Trump accidentally deported a Maryland father with protected status to El Salvador. And I think we haven't mentioned this, but it's worth going into the details. He says what they're not telling us is that this father is an illegal alien and is a member of MS-13. What they're not telling us is that a judge previously ruled he could be deported, just not to El Salvador. So the, quote, accident isn't that he was an innocent man. The accident is, if you will, that he was deported to the wrong country. But again, that's based upon one judge's ruling, and I don't want to get into the the real details about whether a presidential executive order and a State Department and even the, if you will, border czar and others can go over the particular ruling of the judge, but we'll leave that for another day. And then goes on to remind us, okay, if only the media cared as much about Lake and Riley, Rachel Morin, Elizabeth Medina, Jocelyn Nugarani, and a number of others. And so, again, he reminds us of what has been taking place. He says the Biden administration aggressively prosecuted pro-life activists engaged in free speech by praying and singing at an abortion clinic. And again, if you say, I haven't heard about that, most of these have links. You can follow the links. The media was silent about that violation of speech and a number of others. Now, all of a sudden, the media now cares about free speech, and that allows him to get into the other one, which we've talked about. Mahmoud Khalil, who is a Syrian citizen studying in the United States, was arrested for protesting, but he wasn't praying or singing. He was encouraging Jewish hatred. He's not an American citizen. He's a radical Islamic extremist and a leader of an anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-American group that has been rioting in Columbia University, and his protests led to Jewish students being terrorized. So again, he sets up the compromise or the contrast, if you will. To the leftist media, Christian grandmothers praying at an abortion clinic are terrorists, while anti-Semitic foreign Islamists are heroes. And so again, he goes on to remind us that right now we can't really even get some of the positives. If you, for example, talk about the fact that there are 70 countries that are now contacting the Trump administration because they want to work out a deal, or there have been trillions of dollars of new investments now pledged to the United States, you probably are going to hear that in a place like Point of View. Not sure you're going to hear it too many other places. And so that's why he points out at the end that the approval rating for a variety of things, including the media, is pretty much in the basement. That is a very quick summary of 5 pages, or 4 or 5 pages, but if you'd like to read it, it's our 4th article, and it just goes through quite a bit of many facts that I'd forgotten about that remind us you don't necessarily have to trust everything you see in print or you see on a computer screen or on your television screen. It's worth checking out because, sadly, there have just been a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and even though the media is accusing us of doing it, oftentimes they're the ones that are engaging in it. That's all we have for today. So let me again encourage you to find some of these articles as well as the book by Michael Youssef, which I highly recommend because those are all great resources. Again, you can find it at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Megan Kitchen for her help engineering the program. Steve Miller, thank you for producing the program. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
we will see if we can do 5. Now, here's